Do you think that's what's driving it right now is just obviously China is dominating the news here in the States. I'm not sure how present it is over in Europe currently, but here it's all we hear about, especially with our tariffs and Trump's posturing towards China right now. Do you think that's kind of what's driving a lot of this desire for people to understand what's really going on here?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of things that are going on at once. I mean, there's a lot that happens globally, right? There's a lot of different sort of stories competing for airtime in the news. The story of China and the story of US-China relations is, in some senses, it is absolutely a story of trade wars and escalation and all of the sort of the brouhaha that has been going up recently. But it's also a story that has a much more sort of long-term, quieter dynamic as well. And I think that's the story that has, I think, a lot of different thinkers and a lot of different policymakers really seeking to understand, which is, what are the long-term repercussions of the changes happening within China, the implications of that for US-China relations, the implications of that for the global economy. And I think those questions are much more structural and long-term. And so in that sense, I think, yes, it's garnering interest amongst people because of the headlines, but it's also just a matter of seeking to make sense of what kind of direction the global international order is moving in. And China is an important part of that story.
Do you think that foreign leaders have an understanding of China that is accurate?
I mean, it depends on which foreign leaders you're speaking of. And I would also say that, I mean, accuracy is a really tricky concept too, because, I mean, whether or not I as an Australian would agree with whether others have an accurate depiction of Australia is in some senses dependent on the individual or dependent on the political persuasion of the person making the comment, whether they be a prime minister from one political party or the other. So in that sense, accuracy isn't, it's in the eye of the beholder, and it's very, very political. It's always going to be. But a broader understanding of the history and the culture and the politics of China is absolutely something that I think a large proportion of the global community does need to make sense of. I mean, my home country is Australia, although I haven't lived there now for over 10 years. And there has always been a real push to have a stronger Asian literacy within Australia, a stronger sense of understanding of the region and Australia's place within it. And that has never really been addressed in a systemic and meaningful way by political leaders. Higher education spaces and school sectors still don't have strong Asian language education systems, Asian history teaching. Similarly, I think here in Europe, I've been living in the UK for about 4.5 years. And I think that I've really noticed a real limitation in how much understanding there is of China specifically, but Asia more broadly here in the UK. There's much more literacy, I think, on the United States or on Europe than there is on Asia more particularly, and China specifically. I think in the United States, again, it depends on where you are. There's this real strong understanding of Asia and China, particularly within certain groups, within certain demographics. On the West Coast, for example, a very vibrant Chinese American community that are at the center, I think, of some of the conversations there, similarly in New York. But again, I think on a national scale and a sort of larger framework, the knowledge of China and its place within the world, particularly coming from Washington, is very limited and very much something that needs to be addressed.
Do you think that is just how, or just a result of how the early 1900s played out when you have the Korean War and the Vietnam War and World War II and all of these different factors at play, that China just, especially from an economic standpoint, it just didn't seem like there was the potential for this bustling economy that there is currently, especially going into the 1970s. You start to see these these footholds start to take place?
Well, China's place in the 20th century was a complex one. And I would say that it was absolutely front and center of American politics, actually, for a very large proportion of the 20th century, most particularly in the mid-20th century, when Mao Zedong declares the establishment of the People's Republic of China. That victory in the Chinese Civil War unleashes an incredible amount of soul searching in the United States amongst policymakers, many of whom thought of themselves as able to influence the Chinese Civil War and influence the outcome, and were shocked that it was the communists who won that war over the nationalists. And in response, Joseph McCarthy unleashed a torrent of witch hunts and searches for civil servants, people working within the State Department who supposedly lost China to communism, looking to blame American policymakers for decisions and actions that happened within China itself. And in that sense, I think the story of China was central to American politics. It drove a lot of the Cold War fears. So China was at the center of the McCarthy witch hunts. It was at the center of Cold War fears and animosities that were being stoked. Richard Nixon and other congressmen within the United States used this threat of China and this huge communist nation to justify an extraordinary number of policies, including, as you've mentioned, the war in Korea, but also in Vietnam a little later on. There's this real fear that communism was spreading in this period. So in that sense, China was front and center of the way in which American policymakers understood the world. And it's always played a significant part of how I think American policymakers think about the system more broadly. So in the 1970s and particularly the 1980s, as China implements reforms, Deng Xiaoping implements the reform and opening period, that's a real moment too when these reforms were interpreted by American policymakers to be putting China, I suppose, on the right path, on a path towards political liberalization, not just economic liberalization. And, the violence that came afterwards in Tiananmen in 1989 really gave a sense of that trajectory to be the sort of the wrong ending, the sort of the story not going towards political liberalization, but instead towards repression and violence. And that, again, I think tells us something quite significant about the ways that American policymakers have always approached China. And that is through a very emotional lens and through a very sort of emotive way of thinking about change within China, but also from a proprietorial one, from a space in which American policymakers have a particular capacity to have an overly large influence on changes that happen within China. We see that with the Who Lost China debate in the 1950s, but similarly in the 1990s, this idea that liberalization didn't go the right way, and what can the United States do to rectify that situation?
My understanding of the 50s and 60s is limited, especially in terms of China. But one of the things that is fascinating, especially in your book, is watching how the Red China narrative just completely starts to unwind in the 70s as this potential for trade and this idea that there are 400 million customers and we can outsource our products to China and essentially build this consumer economy starts to take shape, and Red China just slowly starts to dissipate. Obviously, you still have people in Congress and labor leaders who are trying to ignite that throughout the 70s, but for the public, it just kind of washes away. And it seems like it had such a strong hold that we were so anti-communist that you would think, oh, we're never going to normalize relations with China. This just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the sort of cultural transformations that I trace in my book, and it's thinking about how it is that the United States went from a country that was so vehemently China particularly so vehemently anti-communist, and as this extraordinary threat, justifying escalating the war in Vietnam, justifying intervention earlier in Korea, as you mentioned. But I think this transformation is partly a product of that realization of the overreach by the 1970s, the war in Vietnam had been going on for years and showing no real sense of victory or a sense of anything other than violent mess for the United States. And there was also by this point a real shift, I think, in cultural relations to communism and to what Maoism itself represented. There was a real interest actually amongst young university students, leftists and radicals at the time, the sort of the hippie movement, the peace movement, who also saw within Maoism and within the vision that Mao represented alternative ways of structuring society. And so I think for all of those reasons, there was already a predisposition towards seeing China differently in the 1960s in particular, that by the 1970s laid the groundwork for a larger set of diplomatic changes that happened with sort of Nixon declaring he was going to go to China, he was going to meet with Mao, this real moment of change. And so that moment of change absolutely built on these sort of prior changes happening in other circles within the United States that softened the idea of the Chinese communist threat. But I do still think it's important to underscore this was still a shock. Like Nixon declaring that he and Mao were going to meet, it was still a shock, right? It was still a major transformation. And the reason that it was so able to be dramatized in the way that it was partly the politics of Nixon and Kissinger making sure that it came across as a surprise and came across as this really momentous historic moment. They curated that sense of historicity, but at the same time, there were major, I think, concerns of communism and of what China represented that still needed to be overcome in the 1970s. As you say, labor groups within the United States absolutely still referred to Red China and saw China as a threat. So there were sort of shifting cultural ideas of China, but there was a lot of resistance to that too.
Can you kind of set the deck and explain the pieces on the board as we start to enter the 1970s, especially as we get into the Nixon shocks?
Say that again?
Can you just kind of align where we were with China prior to going into the 1970s as we built up to the Nixon shocks and you have the Kissinger meeting and Nixon goes to China and you start to see this opening really start to formalize?
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose I'll pick up where I left off earlier then, which is, so Mao declares the People's Republic of China in 1949, the victory from the Chinese Civil War, which in the United States unleashes this whole big McCarthyite purge. But one of the things that then happens is a few months later, the United States and China find themselves as the two main combatants in the Korean War. So within the space of about 10 months, the Soviet Union had tested its atomic bomb. The Chinese Communist Party had declared victory, and the United States and China came to war in Vietnam, where the in Korea, where the North Koreans had declared their attempts to establish a communist regime there. So you see within 10 months, communism strengthening within Asia, and you see it spreading. This real fear that communism was growing in strength and expanding outwards. And part of, I think, that fear then underscores why the United States imposes a trade embargo on China during the Korean War. China then responds in kind, not dissimilar in some ways to the world we live in today with trade embargoes, although this was a complete embargo. So it cut off all trade ties, it cut off all cultural ties, and all kinds of connections between the two countries. And even as the Korean War ends in the mid-1950s, the United States insists on keeping this trade embargo with China in place. And it's not just a trade embargo, it's a embargo on all forms of travel, including visas. So it's basically keeping in place this infrastructure to divide the two societies. It was stronger and stricter than the United States had on the Soviet Union. So even with the Soviet Union, the United States continued to trade with the Soviets at the height of the Cold War. With China, right up until Nixon meets with Mao, or just before then in the 1970s, 1971, 72, it's right up until 1971, 72 that the United States keeps that embargo in place. So for over 20 years, from the Cold War right up until this 1970s moment, the US and China are in effectively an isolation, a Cold War isolation. And that really frames their relationship throughout the 1950s and 1960s. So it's precisely that isolation that helps explain why in the 1970s there was so much shock and so much surprise and also a lot of joy that the United States and China were beginning to reestablish relations. Now, of course, reestablishing a relationship with the communists or sort of opening up that relationship had profound implications for the nationalists in Taiwan, because throughout that 20-odd year period, throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, it was the nationalists on the island of Taiwan who were seen in the eyes of the United Nations and in the eyes of the United States to be the representatives of China. So throughout the 50s and 60s, it was the nationalist government in the Republic of China who were seen to be the representatives of China, and they did so in the United Nations. And so that starts to change in the 1970s. The UN votes to shift which polity would represent China, have the seat in the Security Council, etc. And again, we see a real reconfiguration of what it even means to speak of US-China relations, that becomes a story from the 1970s as one about the United States and the Communist Party, with Taiwan as being a polity that was engaged with in relationship to that.
And that's a recurring theme you see throughout the 70s, and especially in your book, is this dynamic of Taiwan essentially freaking out each stage we move forward with China. You have these Buy American programs that they start to implement. You have people in Congress and labor movements, especially, who are also saying, hey, what are we doing with these imports? The market can't handle this. We can't compete. And yet at each turn, again, we just continue to move with China. We obviously still strengthen our ties with Taiwan and try to play that strategic ambiguity aspect, but the train keeps rolling down the tracks.
I mean, to a degree, but I mean, there were very strong supporters of Taiwan in US politics, particularly in the 1970s. And it's precisely the strength of the relationship between the United States and the Republican government that meant that the rapprochement that began with Nixon and Mao in 1972 wasn't able to be fully achieved. The United States wasn't able to shift its embassy, for example, to Beijing from Taipei. It wasn't able to do that until the very late 1970s, 1978, when it took two new leaders as well, Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter, to finally sort of solidify that movement towards normalization, and the embassies open up a few years later. So the capacity to actually have a fully formed diplomatic relationship was very, very difficult, and it was fraught precisely because of the nature of the United States' relationship with Taiwan, the military ties, the political ties, etc. And there were very strong interests within the United States seeking to keep it as it was. I mean, the Taiwanese government as well was very, very active in positioning itself as the polity that had much stronger economic ties with the United States. So the buy Taiwan goods or made in Taiwan goods were used by Taiwan propaganda outlets as examples of, precisely why the United States should continue its relationship with them and not shift to the communists who had very limited industrial capacity and were very much sort of an impoverished country at this point. That Taiwan, much smaller with a much smaller population, has a much larger economic relationship with the United States and a lot more to give. And so there was a lot of support for Taiwan coming both from within its own government, but also within the United States, and making the argument that they had far greater sort of ties with the US.
Do you think that was maybe the primary factor that was slowing down the relationship between the Americans and the Chinese? Was just the Taiwan aspect?
It was the major diplomatic sticking point. So it was the major thing that diplomats from the United States and the PRC, what they were like debating throughout the 1970s. It was the major sticking point, yeah.
Well, I think some of that just comes from how both nations approached trade in relation to politics. You had the U.S., who was trying to use trade as a means of improving political standing, and then you had the Chinese, who were using political standing to improve trade. So you have these two nations that are trying to approach it almost in reverse. And it seems like, at least from my understanding of your book, that the U.S. almost seceded a lot of ground in terms of politics just for the potential of trade.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things going on there. I mean, I would depict it more as the relationship between diplomatic issues and whether or not to build a trade relationship. It operated differently in the United States than it did in China. And so the big issue throughout the 1970s for policymakers in both countries was, can we build a relationship, a diplomatic relationship, a trade relationship, etc.? Can we rebuild ties after this multi-decade isolation that has so defined the two countries? And for the United States, because trade with China was so small, precisely because the numbers were so low, precisely because trade with Taiwan and elsewhere was much larger, there was a sense that the trade itself didn't matter so much for the economic value, that trade on the part of American policymakers was seen as important for what it symbolized in terms of diplomatic overtures, diplomatic interest in building a relationship again. And in that sense, trade was a tool in demonstrating a larger diplomatic imperative that they wanted to signal to China, we want to rebuild a relationship more broadly. We'll give you trade concessions and we'll use trade as a way of indicating our larger interests in building a political relationship. Whereas for Chinese policymakers, their understanding of the relationship between trade and diplomacy was quite distinct and quite different. It was that if you want to trade with us, we've got to have much better political relations first. So trade wasn't a way of improving the diplomacy so much it was a symbol that the diplomacy was going well. And when in the middle of the decade, partly as a consequence of the Watergate scandal in the United States and partly as a consequence of Mao's very ill health and soon death, and all the politics that was going on within China as a result of that, you have both countries really stall in the middle 1970s, stall on their capacity to even rebuild a trade and a diplomatic relationship. And it's in that moment that you see China start to pull back from its trade with the United States because the diplomacy is not going so well. The conversations at that higher elite level is not going so well. So neither, in their view, would trade go well either. And so precisely because of that different push-pull relationship to trade, US policymakers sought to leverage trade to sort of ease the political tensions that were going on with the Chinese. And precisely because they saw it as such small numbers, as not particularly economically significant, they were willing to do so. And so where this particularly takes place, or where these interests particularly converged, was that Chinese policymakers and Chinese, particularly the more pragmatic-minded members of the Politburo wanted to use Chinese exports to fund their industrialization, to fund their attempts to rebuild China and to sort of build this sort of strong nation. And so selling textile goods and other things to the United States or elsewhere was a way of gaining funds that might be able to then be used to buy infrastructure needed. So it's that interest that they had in selling goods that US policymakers therefore understood that imports, so buying US importers of Chinese goods, bringing Chinese goods into the United States would be a way of indicating that trade was going, or indicating an interest in improving relations, and doing so in a way that would be in alignment with what Chinese policymakers themselves had an interest in. And precisely because there was this idea that, well, there's small numbers anyway, or it's just a small textile industry that would be affected, there was this idea that would be, the cost-benefit analysis was such that it would be better off, that American policymakers and trade organizations would be better off encouraging Chinese exports to the United States. And one of the big arguments that I make is that even though there were these dynamics at play, and even though the numbers were low at this point, one of the larger structural changes that this facilitated was a reconfiguration of how China is understood, that China was beginning to be understood not just as a place to sell to, not just as a place to sell the big technology, the fertilizer factories, or the goods that were made in America, but also a place to buy from, a place where Americans could buy cheap goods, textiles in particular, at this period of time. And that is a real change in how China itself and how the trade itself was understood. Just a few decades earlier, there was a real understanding of China as, one businessman in the 1930s called it, China was a place of 800 million customers, or 400 million customers, sorry. So, China with such a large population was a place where you could make your wealth by selling your goods to Chinese customers, 400 million customers. That very idea of what China represented, of turning into a space where you could get cheap labor, 800 million workers, from customers to workers, that shift was beginning to take place, partly because of this diplomacy, but also, and this is the other big sort of transformation that I trace in the book, also because the structures of industrialization and manufacturing were themselves also internationalizing in this moment. The movement towards supply chain manufacturing, the movement towards internationalized shipping, these were things that had been happening throughout the Cold War, throughout the 1950s and 60s. And by the 1970s, were really beginning to underpin the global political economy. And so the reopening with China came at precisely this moment, that the structures in manufacturing and trade and how goods were even made, the movement towards offshore manufacturing was happening precisely at the moment that China began to re-engage with the United States and become integrated into the capitalist economy.
Do you think that trade with China initially, from an American stance, was maybe a little bit skewed, that they were naive in some ways? Obviously, it seems like China was very intentional with their setup in some ways again. They wanted to fund technological imports by focusing on exports. They didn't want to be subservient in terms of trade. They didn't want to be 400 million customers. They wanted to be 800 million workers. They wanted that self-reliance. That change seemed more gradual from the state's perspective. But even then, they were aware of the potential. You had Nixon talking in 1971 about how in building up China, we are potentially building up an adversary, not just for us, but for the world.
He doesn't say adversary, though. He doesn't see it as, he says we might be building up a strong space for production. He doesn't say adversary.
He says economic challenge, which is even more kind of laissez-faire.
One of the things that was happening in this period, I think, or there were a few things, but one thing to really pull out here is there were significant American groups, who really benefited from these changes that were happening. There were American corporations and American, so both the large-scale ones, so the Westinghouses, the Kellogg Fertilizer Companies, and others. They saw themselves as benefiting from integrating with China and opening up to China. Ford Motors, for example, a lot of these big corporate sort of titans of American capitalism in this period saw the potential for wealth that they could make, so much so that they often lost money. They often traded at a loss. So Ford Motors, for example, would often import from China, import tea, rugs. They would put them in the Ford Motors headquarters. Bank of America had a whole bunch of rugs in their Chicago offices, sort of these beautiful ancient rugs that they purchased from China, because they knew that if they wanted to eventually sell or set up relations with China, they needed to indicate an interest by buying from China first, from doing so from purchasing rather than selling. And so there were a lot of companies that had an interest in China and who benefited from China in the long term, even though in this 1970s period, many experienced an economic loss. I think the question about what was motivating whether more policymakers, Nixon or whoever, if we use Nixon as a symbol of larger policymaking thinking at this time, there was an idea that China was so, in this period, it was still such a developing country. It was so impoverished. It had gone through an incredible amount of warfare and still had an incredible series of sort of modernization battles that it was facing. There was an idea that China might sort of strengthen its economy. China might become a stronger power, but there wasn't connected to that this notion that would somehow overtake the United States, so that would somehow threaten the United States' position in the world. Not at least in terms of sort of the economic threat. That was still not a significant way in which American policymakers thought about China. So even as there were debates, real heated debates in the 90s about whether to grant China most favored nation trade status after the violence in the massacre in Xiamen and elsewhere in China in 1989, there was a real connection that was then made in the aftermath of that between granting China most favored nation trading status and human rights. Even in those debates, there was a real there were a whole questions that were going on, most of which were the political orientation of China, not so much the sort of economic threat. Some were worried about the economic threat that China posed by the 90s, but it was still not framed in the sense of China's going to take on a hegemonic role. That wasn't really the sort of underpinning or major thread of American thinking in this period. Really it's not until the 21st century that some of those sort of ideas start to gain particular traction. You can find singular counterpoints to this, but the bigger conversations weren't about that. They assumed an American hegemony right through until the 2000s onwards, and it's really in the 2010s that we see a real debate start to come forth about the extent to which that hegemony might be threatened. But really, until then, it's not a particularly strong part of how Americans understood China's power, even as they thought maybe China will become a strong economic power. That wasn't necessarily linked to threat. It's that threat that has actually only come up in more recent years. We see it partly come out. We saw it partly come out with Obama's pivot to Asia in the 2010s. We've seen it obviously under Donald Trump and continued under Biden and Trump again. But that sort of notion of hegemony as being at stake, it's really actually a 21st century phenomenon in many ways.
Yeah, it seems like even for later labor leaders who were worried and did seem to have more of an understanding of at least the economic damage that would be a result of these improved trade relations, you had politicians and big business essentially pushing those concerns to the side at every step they could take.
Yeah, and I mean, so this is part of, I think, the assumption at the time that labor was an impediment to foreign policy making, that labor interests, the interests of American workers, were not as important as the larger diplomatic goals of American policymakers. And so that's partly why there was this real sense that the textile industry, which was the first to be affected by reopening relations with China, that's why they were seen as expendable. And I think there's this been a very, very deep underlying assumption in American liberalism throughout the 20th century and up until the 21st that had prioritized the interests of capital and of corporate power over the interests of labor. And I think we're living now through a world where the repercussions of those values and the repercussions of what is prioritized over something else is really starting to bite back. And it's what Trump has been so successful at tapping into, that disaffection, that labor disaffection, even though his policies are making it harder for American workers. He's still able to sort of galvanize that real sense of concern that working people's interests have not been met and have not been listened to by those working either in Washington or in Wall Street.
You did have inklings, though. You had some individuals who were kind of trying to sound the alarm for various reasons, personal or otherwise, especially in terms of business, but they just couldn't get any traction.
Yeah, I have a whole section on American textile workers who launched the first case ever against Chinese Communist Party, who, as you're saying, were very, very concerned about the larger implications of opening a trade relationship with China and emphasizing this sort of Chinese exports as coming into the United States. But this gets to the bigger point that I was making, where their voices were not listened to. Their voices were actively, in fact, worked against, and not only by sort of, diplomats and State Department officials in Washington. It wasn't only the political class who saw these petitions for restrictions on Chinese goods and thought this is going to make it more difficult for us to have diplomatic conversations and negotiations with our Chinese counterparts, which absolutely drove the policymakers. But it was also seen as a concern. These attempts to have limitations on Chinese imports were also seen to be a concern for American corporate companies themselves. Many of them didn't want the complete restrictions on trade with China at all. They wanted the restrictions to be in place in order to have market order, so that you don't have dumping, that you don't have this sort of communist country just coming in and dumping a whole bunch of work gloves, like cotton work gloves or cotton goods, that you have market order. But they themselves were actually quite interested in and desirous of cheaper Chinese goods that were coming in. Workers working in the steel industry and in the auto industry actually benefited from the cheaper work gloves that came in from China, because they themselves also faced extraordinary austerity measures during this period, and having some places to cut costs to have cheaper Chinese gloves that they wore underneath their bigger work gloves, for example, was just a way of sort of cutting down the bottom line. And so there was a very complex set of interests in actually encouraging cheaper Chinese goods to come into the United States. Groups that were wanting restrictions and wanting things to be in sort of coming in a market order, but they were also still very willing to have the cheaper goods come in from China as it benefited them. So it's a really complex story of who was benefiting and why.
And the irony being, again, that these manufacturers were large buyers of these products that they were trying to stop from coming in, again, for the market stability so that they could outsource the manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, so this particular case that I referenced, like the first time that a group of American workers launched a case for restrictions on communist China, it sort of goes under the radar. Partly this is because they lost, but the group of people, they were makers, they were glove makers and glove companies, and they were calling for restrictions on Chinese cotton work gloves. As I say, these are cotton work gloves that are worn by workers in sort of heavy machinery spaces. So working in the steel industry, you'd put the cotton glove on and then put the other glove on top. Similarly in the auto industry. And what is really important about the group who were calling for restrictions coming in from China, the group who were the first ones to call for trade restrictions on China, a vast majority of them were actually importers of those gloves. So they wanted restrictions on the very things that they themselves were buying. And what they wanted was not to stop the goods from coming in, but to make sure that there's this sort of market order that was underpinning it, that you wouldn't have dumping, to allow for them as glove companies to outsource the cotton work gloves, so to no longer make cotton work gloves perhaps in their glove factories, but to double down on their leather gloves or their other kinds of gloves that they made within the factory doors, so that they sort of ceded the ground, if you will, to China and said, okay, China, you can make the cotton work gloves because it's labor intensive and you can do it more cheaply, and we will keep our doors open, our glove factory doors open, by specializing in leather gloves and other kinds and particular kinds of gloves, more specialized kinds of gloves. And so here again, you see that the interests were very, very complex. It wasn't just, Washington not wanting to have the restrictions placed on China, but it was also actually the people wanting the restrictions themselves were still actually wanting the cheap goods to come from China. They just wanted it in a particular way.
And so you have this business dynamic playing out, and especially for the Work Glove Manufacturers Association case with the USITC, you have U.S. officials talking to Chinese counterparts saying, hey, we're getting a lot of pushback stateside. You need to slow your imports. Otherwise, we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And they do.
Yeah, and they do. And so when I found these sort of the evidence of this in the archives, I was like, because I knew that it was happening, and to find the evidence was this real moment of, there we go, right? So so you have U.S. government officials tipping off their Chinese counterparts and saying, look, we have labor groups who are about to launch this case. Just hold off for a few months. Hold off on your sales of cotton gloves to us here in the United States, because then the numbers will go down. When the ITC considers the whole case, they'll be able to see that, well, actually Chinese exports have decreased in recent months. And that did actually play a role in the decision-making processes of some of the commissioners in the ITC. And so here we had another sort of example where, precisely because of the nature of China's manufacturing and its politics, was that they were able to intervene quite quickly in stopping the exports to the United States and influence the trade numbers overall.
Which you had people who were concerned with free market exploitation sounding the alarm on this, saying, hey, because China's a communist country, they can just stop and start production like this. So we can't plan from a market standpoint in the States, but also, how do we implement any restrictions when they can change on a dime?
Right. And this is precisely what those calling for the restrictions were saying, which is why they were like, we're dealing with a completely different entity, right? Like this is a country that operates and manufactures very differently. And that's precisely why they were calling for quotas. They weren't calling for tariffs, but for quotas. So they were saying, we want there to be a limited number of Chinese cotton work gloves coming in. So it wasn't just we want to restrict. If they restricted based on price, if they just put in a sanction of some sort, or made it more expensive, a tax or a duty, it would just be offset by China sort of paying its workers even less, right? Who they earned very little anyway. And so that was precisely why the case was a case for quotas, that regardless of the price, regardless of how much the Chinese sold their goods, their cotton gloves for, what they wanted, what these American workers were calling for was a limited number. So quotas as being the key way to do that.
And so obviously they lose this US-ITC case. And then if we jump forward a little bit, the issues are still growing, and we have the clothespin case against the US-ITC, which they actually do win. The US-ITC makes a recommendation, seems like it might go through, and Carter pulls the plug.
Yeah. So this is the clothespin. We're talking about such niche industries, aren't we? Right? Like, so cotton work gloves. Like, I became so deeply embedded in the cotton work glove industry and in the clothespin industry, like specifically wooden clothespin as well, like not any old clothespin. And that's again another example where in that case, another sort of, and they were very specifically these small cases that were used as sort of almost like literally canaries in the coal mine, if you will, where they were used as test cases to see how would Carter respond, how will the ITC respond, how can we build up our cases successfully. And so these small industries were used precisely because they were so affected, but also because they gave a sort of larger gauge as to how other groups within the textile industry or within the manufacturing industry might be able to approach it. And to see Carter, again, as you're pointing out, to intervene in a case where because the ITC only makes recommendations. It can assess the situation and makes a recommendation. It's the president who ultimately decides whether to enforce it. And in Carter's case, we see again, a real privileging of diplomacy, a privileging of the geopolitical priorities of the time. It's a really tricky moment diplomatically. Carter's trying to sort of normalize relations with China and trying to improve that dynamic there. And to have this clothespin case would have sort of been seen to be undermining that larger geopolitical imperative. And here again, it's about this bigger, I think, assumption that has so driven 20th century American politics on both sides of the aisle, that assumes or sees labor interests, American worker interests, as a impediment to their larger geopolitical goals, as an irritant to their goals, rather than as something that should be a sort of at the heart of how foreign policy operates.
If you were to zoom out, do you think that the fact that they started with these smaller markets like textiles and clothespins and were building in those industries, that was kind of the primary driving factor, that they were able to see these canaries in the coal mines? And because they were small and niche, there wasn't just this wave that crashed down and people started screaming, hey, we need to do something. They were able to kind of just swim through the system a little bit.
Well, I think part of it has much more to do with the nature of the industries themselves. So textiles have, especially in the 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries, been predominantly female-dominated industries, sort of women workers are at the forefront of it. And they've been very, very labor-intensive. And so they've often been at the forefront, and the textile industry more broadly has been at the forefront of a lot of the repercussions of changes in manufacturing and the internationalization of manufacturing. So it's not so much that China found a niche and worked its way into it, so much as China was part of a larger sort of pattern, in fact, of industrialization, where you begin to specialize in the labor-intensive parts of industrialization, such as textiles, where you can have a comparative advantage because you offer cheaper labor. So in the United States itself, textile manufacturing shifted from Lowell, Massachusetts and the Northeast down to the South in the 19th to early 20th centuries, precisely because of the lower paid, ununionized labor that American workers in the South represented. It was, you could set up a mill and you could set up textile manufacturing in the South cheaper than you could in the predominantly unionized North. And so you see this real transfer of manufacturing locations pursuing the cheapest possible labor. And doing so precisely because textile manufacturing is so labor intensive. By the 1950s or so, you start to see the shift towards outsourced manufacturing, towards manufacturing textile goods in Asia, in parts of Mexico and other parts of Latin America, and really starting to use the sort of changes in shipping and changes in communications to their advantage, to the advantage of manufacturing industry's advantage. And so, again, this real shift in location is very much tied to a pursuit for cheap labor. So in that sense, China was sort of building upon that larger sense of comparative advantage, if you will, precisely because of its very large population who were paid so little. It's underpinned still by this notion in China too of devaluing labor.
So the inroads were already there. They were almost capitalizing on them. You have these corporations already chasing this cheap labor stateside, moving manufacturing. And obviously when China comes on the scene, that's cheap labor times 100.
It's cheap labor times 100, but only because of the policy decisions that were made and the debates that happened within China itself. So one of the things that I'm very I really center in the book is to think about the ways that to understand how we live in a world where everything, or almost everything nowadays, has made in China written on it. To understand how we got to that point necessitates looking at two things at once, two things together. And that is the changes happening within American capitalism and the capitalist system more broadly, the changes towards offshore manufacturing and deindustrialization as a consequence of that within the United States. We need to understand those dynamics on the one hand, but we also need to understand the policy choices that Chinese pragmatists began to make, particularly from the late 1960s and 1970s onwards, in the latter years of the Cultural Revolution, when they began to think that positioning China as a place of cheap labor, positioning China as a source of cheaper goods might be the way to help industrialize China and help build the socialist vision that these policymakers within the Politburo so wanted to take China towards. And those two interests began to work together. That's the real sort of the real dynamic that I'm interested in and trace within the book, that we see this convergence of interests. And it's that convergence of interests where China eventually, not in the 1970s, but eventually is able to really put its foot down on the accelerator and accelerate the process of globalized manufacturing and globalization that we now describe today. That it was able to do that precisely because of these two changes that began to occur earlier, the changes within capitalism and the changes within the Chinese Politburo. That's a dynamic that worked really co-constitutively.
What was the relationship specifically between Mao and the Politburo as we were moving into the 70s? Because obviously you have, it seems like just various people vying for power and a direction that they would like to see China in. You have the Gang of Four, you have these radicals who really want to draw more inward and see taking these exports from other countries as kind of a detriment. And then you have the more moderates who are saying, no, we need to go down this path. We need to focus on the four new normalizations. We need to build our technology and science, our agriculture, our defense.
Yeah, I mean, the Politburo in this period was extraordinarily, it was violent, it was, very, very contentious. And it was a period of real flux, political flux within China. So Mao had launched in the mid-1960s a cultural revolution, an attempt to sort of build this socialist world and socialist sort of nation through a literal cultural reinvigoration and revolution. It was extraordinarily violent and chaotic. And by the late 1960s, it sort of enters a second phase. And part of the consequences of that chaos of the Cultural Revolution is that it opened up spaces for more pragmatically minded politicians within China to push for a different approach, to say, look, we've had a great leap forward in the late 1950s, and that led to famine and devastation on a huge scale. We've had the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, and that's led to chaos and violence in a different way. We need a new approach. We need to start experimenting with other ways of industrializing and bringing our society into a place of strength. And so it's precisely in the aftermath, or in sort of the waning years of that Cultural Revolution violence, that you have a cohort of people who were able to sort of really haltingly experiment with ways of industrializing China and using exports to fund the imports of big sort of industrial goods that they needed. These were attempts and ideas that had emerged in the early 1950s in China, but were very quickly sort of swept aside through the Great Leap Forward, and then again swept aside with the Cultural Revolution. So it's by the 1970s that you have a lot of the same people from the 1950s come to the 1970s and say, look, it's time to give it a go. It's time to sort of see a different approach. But it was met with extraordinary resistance. As you say, the Gang of Four and others within the Politburo saw these rightists, they were considered to be rightists or capitalist roadsters, as really sort of taking China down the wrong path and taking China down a path towards the United States. And so this sort of more radical left-wing group within the Politburo very fiercely resisted. And there were periods, just particularly in the mid-1970s, 1973, 74, where they really gained control, particularly 74, 75, gain control of the Politburo and they get Mao's ear right in the sort of the last stages of his death. So it's, at this time too, we have these different posturing elements within the Politburo that are enabled too, in many ways, by the very fact that Mao is so ill by this point and dies by 1976. And so this moment of real flux, I think, within China is also a really important reminder that there was nothing natural or inevitable about the outcome that we now do know with retrospect has happened, that there was a lot of contingency, there was a lot of uncertainty, both within China and within the United States. And I use the term experiments in the book, that these pragmatic policymakers within the Politburo were experimenting with ways of industrialization, just to sort of underscore just how uncertain they themselves were. Right, it was an experiment for them too. So there were these sort of larger patterns that we can detect in retrospect, but it is also very, very important, I think, to underscore just how uncertain so much of this history is, and how uncertain the policymakers at the time, both within the United States and within China, were of the larger repercussions. And ultimately, it's a history of unintended consequences. It wasn't an intended consequence of either country, really, that we live in the world that we do live in today. And I think that is a really important reminder for the world that we do live in, that there are always going to be unintended consequences to political and social decisions that get made.
Unintended consequences, and also just chaos to some extent. I mean, that was really surprising going through your book, is that obviously you have what Nixon was going through stateside and all of our issues at home, but you also have these economic and social issues in China, and it just seems like the perfect mix, that there's so much chaos, there's so much up in the air, that it just bred what we see today, just the seeds.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot actually, because when I first started the book, I was around 2012 when I began research for the book. And that was a very different context. So 2012 or so, it was a time when there were a lot of American policymakers still making the argument that the United States and China wouldn't go to war, that war was not inevitable because of the economic interdependence that binds the two countries, right? That there was so much at stake between them that that economic independence will hold back any kind of conflict. We live in a world where those kinds of arguments are not the norm anymore, and I think rightly so. I think it's a very naive way of thinking about the world. But the change that has happened since I began the book in 2012 and today really reminds me in many ways, and I think the world that we're in today is it's much more chaotic, and we're very aware, I think, that we're living through a period of flux and a period of change in global orders and all of those things, not dissimilar, I think, in some ways to the 1970s. And I think one of the things that is really important to keep in mind is distinguishing between the signal and the noise, between what's the long-term story that's going on here and what's the long-term repercussions, the unintended consequences of the chaos. That is something that we can, I think, think through and should try to think through as we're living through this present-day chaos, because it's those kinds of much more longer-term signals, moving through and passing through the noise, that will help guide as best as possible our political leaders and decision makers towards a world where we don't have such unintended consequences defining the global order, where we do try and think through with a little more care what kinds of consequences we want our decisions to have. So paying attention to longer term sort of dynamics at play can really help arm us, I think, and work us being sort of a collective sort of universalist, us in many ways, a collective and better future.
Yeah, I'm all for running and gunning, but I definitely agree that we could use a little more forethought about what the consequences might be down the road.
Well, you can see maybe behind me, I'm much more of a let's have a think about things and be careful.
How much of a driving factor was Mao specifically prior to and going into his death, as opposed to these other political influences like Zhao Enlai and Deng Xiaoping?
How much was Mao what, sorry?
How much was Mao a driving factor for kind of this push, as opposed to these other political influences on the side?
So even right until Mao's death, nothing was really pursued unless Mao approved it. Mao contradicted himself a lot throughout his time in power, but particularly towards the end of his life. But Zhou and Deng Xiaoping and others were always sort of operating right until the end, according to Mao's agreement. So it was both. It was Deng and Zhou Enlai and others, Chen Yun and others, were absolutely operating, I think, from their own ideological viewpoints as well. But the capacity for them to even act upon those visions was still, until the very end, determined by Mao.
Was Deng sort of a unique case, especially coming into 76 after Mao dies and he seizes power to some extent? How much of what we see today is explicitly because of his actions through the late 70s?
Well, immediately after Mao was a man called Hua Guofang, and Hua is often forgotten about in sort of the larger sort of trajectory. But he also implemented and carried on a lot of these experiments with industrialization, and Deng in many ways was an inheritor of some of those attempts as well. I think Deng was he was a very significant. I mean, precisely because he's of reform and opening, he had a very, very outsized role on the trajectory of modern China, and so for that reason, he's being very, very remembered, and is absolutely a significant political leader within China.
That was the sense that I got from your book. I didn't really understand how he seized power from Hua.
Well, I mean, political power grabs. he backstabbed. I mean, Chinese politics was extraordinarily murky. It remains very much so too. It was raw power, and he aligned the Politburo with him. And Hua was always, in many ways, a sitting duck after sort of the immediate. The Gang of Four themselves had to be ousted and taken out of power very violently and in the dead of night. In fact, then Hua was placed in power. There is a rehabilitation of scholarship, as I say, that's sort of really starting to say, well, there was a lot of significant change that Hua did implement, but Deng was always sort of in the background of all of this. And when his moment came, he swooped in. He brought the politics, hardcore politics, hardcore politicking, and brought his supporters with him. And Hua was always sort of he didn't have the charisma or the leadership to the same degree as someone like Deng Xiaoping had as well.
If we were to guess, how different would things be had the radicals held on to power when they seized it, when the Gang of Four seized power briefly?
Yeah.
What would that have looked like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I mean, I think it's a lot of what ifs if they had stayed in power, but I think there is a sense in which their interest in engaging with the capitalist system in the ways that the pragmatists did was much less, and it would have looked very different. They would have been they wanted to really restrict the trade that China had with the United States, but there was also still an understanding of the necessity to survive, and also still an understanding that the Chinese people needed to be fed, and they needed to have their livelihoods improve. And so we don't know, but in the immediate term, the Gang of Four were very against a lot of these experimentations. But in the longer term, we don't know the extent to which more sort of realistic recalibrations might have come into play as well. It would still, I mean, the world would... there are so many variables, right? But the world would... is always going to be contingent, not just on sort of one change, but the changes around those groups as well. So it certainly would have opened up possibilities for a different kind of world, that's for sure.
It's interesting how one moment like that can change everything, and how even though they had that brief moment of power, they lost it, and the more moderates won out.
Yeah, the Gang of Four had far less support though as well, right? And particularly though, the more pragmatic groups within the Politburo made sure of that. So they then put the Gang of Four on trial. They have these big show courts. They make sure to blame so many of the sort of problems that China did experience on the mismanagement, the malmanagement of the Gang of Four. So they also become scapegoats, and very important scapegoats for the new political class to be able to point to their opposition and say, any of the problems that we've inherited and we're now dealing with are the consequences of the obstructionism of the Gang of Four and of the limitations that they've placed upon our capacity to do these experiments.
So as we move towards the end of the decade and into the 80s, you have the first Chinese ship sailing directly to the United States. You have the Vera Scarf 30th celebration, which marks the first time that a company has designed something and manufactured it over in China. You have Nike in the 80s trade 4 factories, I believe, for the equivalent in shoes. You start to really see the inroads of these companies manufacturing in China and exporting to the US. Was there a point during that time where we could have changed things, where we could have put some limitations on it, could have altered course, maybe provided more protections for an American manufacturing base, or were we already off to the races?
I think the question is this is a question then less about China. I think that's a question. The question of were there alternatives is now not a question about should things have been different with China. And because one of the arguments of the book is that the big source of change is the changes in American capitalism, and that China then accelerated that. But the changes were already there. And in that sense, there were, and I trace earlier on in the book, there were attempts within Congress to limit multinational corporations' powers, the Mills Bill, and others that were launched before Congress in the early 1970s. There were real attempts to limit especially multinational corporations who were setting up foreign direct investment and other things. Keep in mind that none of these companies were able to set up foreign direct investment in China until the 1980s. So I'm looking at a period when the changes were starting to happen even before FDI is permitted. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, the contingent moments had to do with attempts to limit the ways that corporations operated. And there were a few of those moments. The Trade Act of 1974 as well. There were some real attempts to tinker, or not really, to really reform the ways that corporate taxation operates, the ways that corporations worked. But they were questions far bigger than about China. And in fact, China wasn't part really of those conversations, precisely because the trade relationship was so small at this time, precisely because it wasn't the big issue at the time.
One of the things that I'm still grappling with is just,
Nick, I'm so sorry. I thought we were an hour conversation.
Oh, no worries. You got to get out of here.
Got to get out of here soonish. It's about 6 p.m. It's 20 past 6 here, and I've got a few things I've got to get done with the house.
No worries. Can we end? I actually have a quote. I kind of want to just touch on the end of your book, and we can wrap.
Yeah.
Okay. So you say, in regards to everything that you cover in the book, the whole of the 70s, a little bit prior into the 50s, 60s, out into the 80s, you say, and I quote, "By making made in China, U.S. diplomats and business people use trade to lay the groundwork of a process that might, one day, mark the end of their empire and the reemergence of China's." I mean, it seems pretty fitting, given our current context, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the point, is that it's a question of sort of whose interests have benefited from these changes and from this history. And there have been real American corporate interests and groups within the capitalist system who absolutely benefited quite significantly. And so too did China. And so too was China able to lift so many people out of poverty, and so too was it able to really to become the workshop of the world that it still is to this day.
And do you think that's kind of an important reframing in the mind, maybe more so of people in the States, that China didn't kill the manufacturing base in America? Washington kind of did. Our policies, our stance, the goals that we were working to all kind of culminated in what we see today.
Yeah, I mean, I would even add it wasn't just Washington though, right? It was Wall Street, and it was corporate power as well, corporations. It was the pursuit of capital over labor. It was the pursuit of profit over the interests of labor, whether it be American workers or Chinese workers. So it's not Washington per se, it's corporate interests actually that were enabled by Washington and that Washington supported that were the real sort of beneficiaries of this.
which again is just a really apparent theme that runs through the entire book.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do as historians and as scholars is really excavate and unearth who benefits. So who does what to whom, and who is benefiting from these things, and to really unpack those power dynamics and structures underpinning the worlds of the past in order to illuminate the present world as well.
Okay, well, Elizabeth, thank you for taking the time to come on and chat with me.
It was a real pleasure. It was really fun.
Do you want to plug all of your stuff where people can find your book?
Yeah, you can buy my book either on the publisher's website, so Harvard University Press, or you can buy it on sort of, I think, most of the sort of book outlets. And yeah, I've got another one coming. It will take, I hope, not too long, but at least another year, a couple of years or so, thinking about US-China relations from 1949 to the present.